Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Stories with Jane. There's something rather wonderful about a classic mystery, isn't there? The sort where nothing is quite what it seems, and the truth hides beneath layers of carefully constructed deception. Tonight's tale is precisely that, a story of biscuit tins, buried secrets, and lies that span decades. I'm curious, have you ever received a mysterious package in the post? Something unexpected that changed everything? Do tell us in the comments below. A special warm welcome this evening to our listeners in USA. How lovely to have you with us. If you're new to this corner of the internet, do consider subscribing. It truly means the world to this little channel, and it ensures you never miss a story. Now then, settle in with your tea or cocoa. Let us return to 1952. To the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where Miss Jane Marple is about to receive a most unusual delivery. Shall we begin? Chapter 1. The Arrival of the Biscuit Tin. In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where the church bells still tolled the hours with the same reassuring rhythm they had for 2 centuries, the year was 1952. Spring had come late that year, and the hedgerows were only just beginning to show their tentative green. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the window of her charming cottage at Mead, was engaged in her favorite occupation, knitting a soft woolen scarf for her godson while observing the small dramas of village life unfold before her. The postman, young Fred, cycled up the lane with rather more haste than usual. He stopped at her gate, fumbling in his bag. Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes noted the unfamiliar parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "Morning, miss," Fred called cheerfully. "Got something for you from London. Looks important-like." Miss Marple set aside her knitting and received the parcel with a gracious smile. The label was addressed in a shaky elderly hand. "Miss J. Marple, Danemed, St. Mary Mead, no sender's name." The postmark was from Kensington, dated 3 days earlier. Inside the house, with a cup of strong tea beside her, she carefully cut the string. The parcel contained a round, old-fashioned biscuit tin, the sort one saw in grocers' shops before the war, painted with faded images of hunting scenes. The lid was sealed with red wax. Puzzled, she prized it open. The tin was not full of biscuits. It was packed with papers, yellowed letters, newspaper clippings, a small leather-bound notebook, and several photographs. On top lay a single sheet of notepaper. "Dear Miss Marple, if you are reading this, I am almost certainly dead. The things in this tin are not what they seem. They are full of lies. Lies that have ruined lives and will ruin more, unless someone with your particular understanding of human nature intervenes. I beg you do not trust appearances. Come to Gossington Hall if you can. The new owner knows nothing. Yours in desperation, Lady Edith Crawley." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose. Lady Edith Crawley! She had known the name years ago. A distant connection of the Bantrys who had once owned Gossington Hall. Lady Edith had been a formidable woman in her youth, beautiful, wealthy, and rather ruthless in society. She had married Sir Reginald Crawley, a baronet with a crumbling estate in the next county, and had lived there in some seclusion after the war. The village had been buzzing for weeks about Gossington Hall. Colonel and Mrs. Bantry had sold it after that dreadful business with the body in the library. The new owner was a Mr. Harold Blake, a wealthy manufacturer from the north who had made his money in biscuits, ironically enough. He had moved in only a fortnight ago with his young wife and a small staff. Miss Marple read the letter twice, then examined the contents of the tin more closely. The letters were love letters, apparently written by different hands, all addressed to my dearest Edith. Yet the handwriting varied suspiciously. One clipping from the Times announced the engagement of Miss Edith Llewellyn to Sir Reginald in 1919. Another, much later, reported the sudden death of Sir Reginald in 1948. The notebook contained dates, sums of money, and cryptic initials. She closed the tin thoughtfully. "Lies," she murmured. "A tin full of lies. How very interesting." That afternoon, Miss Marple put on her best tweed coat and sensible shoes and made her way to the vicarage. The Reverend Leonard Clement and his wife Griselda were always useful sources of information. "Gossington Hall," Griselda said, pouring tea. "Mr. Blake seems pleasant enough, rather loud but generous. His wife is much younger, pretty little thing, looks rather nervous. They're having some sort of housewarming next week. You should come, Jane. It would do you good." Miss Marple smiled vaguely. "I wonder if Lady Edith is staying with them. I received rather a curious communication from her this morning." The vicar looked surprised. "Lady Edith? I understood she had gone abroad after Sir Reginald's death. The estate was sold to pay death duties, you know. She retained only a small annuity, I believe." Before Miss Marple could reply, the telephone rang. Griselda answered it, and her face grew grave. "It's from Gossington Hall," she whispered, covering the mouthpiece. "There's been an accident. Mr. Blake is dead." By evening, the news had spread through St. Mary Mead like wildfire. Mr. Harold Blake had been found dead in the library at Gossington Hall, sitting at the desk, with a glass of port beside him. The doctor had been called immediately, but it was too late. Heart failure, it was said. Yet the new maid, a local girl named Rose, had whispered to the grocer's boy that there was a strange smell in the room and that Mr. Blake's face had looked all twisted like. Miss Marple sat quietly in her drawing room, the biscuit tin on the table before her. She had not yet mentioned it to anyone. The letter had spoken of death, and death had come swiftly. The following morning, a car drew up outside Danemed. A tall, serious-looking young man in a well-cut suit stepped out. Inspector Dermot Craddock of Scotland Yard, an old acquaintance of Miss Marple's. "Miss Marple," he said, smiling despite the gravity of the situation, "I might have known you would be involved somehow. Colonel Melchett asked me to look into this quietly. The local police are calling it natural causes. But Mrs. Blake is not satisfied. She found something that disturbed her." He accepted a cup of tea and a slice of seed cake. A biscuit tin was mentioned. Empty now, apparently. "Mrs. Blake says her husband received it by post the day before he died. He seemed very upset after opening it. Locked himself in the study for hours." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "How very curious. I received a similar tin yesterday, Inspector. From Lady Edith Crawley." Craddock's eyebrows shot up. "Lady Edith? But she died 3 weeks ago in Switzerland. Heart attack, according to the reports." Miss Marple stopped knitting. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock. "Then," she said gently, "it seems we have a great many lies to unravel, Inspector, and they all appear to be contained within biscuit tins." She rose and fetched the tin from the sideboard. "Shall we begin?" The library at Gossington Hall looked much as it had in the Bantry's day. Shelves of books, heavy velvet curtains, and now a chalk outline where Mr. Blake had fallen. Mrs. Blake, a fragile blonde woman in her 30s, met them with red-rimmed eyes. "He was so excited about the new business," she whispered. "Expanding the biscuit factory. He said this place was perfect for it. Then that tin arrived. He wouldn't let me see what was inside. Only said, 'Old ghosts, my dear, best left buried.'" Miss Marple moved quietly about the room, her eyes missing nothing. A small fragment of red wax on the carpet, a faint scent of almonds lingering near the desk. She picked up a silver photograph frame that had fallen face down. It showed a much younger Harold Blake standing beside a strikingly handsome woman, Lady Edith. "Mrs. Blake," Miss Marple asked mildly, "did your husband ever mention knowing Lady Edith before your marriage?" The young woman hesitated. "He said they were old friends, that she had helped him when he was starting out. But there was something odd. He received a letter from Switzerland the week before, saying she had died. Yet he didn't seem surprised. He seemed relieved." Inspector Craddock examined the tin Mrs. Blake produced, identical to the one Miss Marple had received.
down to the hunting scenes on the lid.
Inside were more papers, share certificates, a marriage certificate dated 1949 between Harold Blake and one Edith Llewellyn, and a will leaving everything to my beloved wife Edith. But Mrs. Blake's name was Violet. Miss Marple looked at the documents with gentle interest. "Lies indeed," she murmured, "layer upon layer of them, like a particularly deceptive box of assorted biscuits." Outside, the spring rain began to fall softly on the lawns of Gossington Hall. Miss Marple knew, with the quiet certainty that had solved so many village mysteries, that this was only the beginning. Somewhere in the shadows of the old house, or perhaps in the cottages of St. Mary Mead itself, someone was watching. Someone who had sent the tins. Someone who was very good at telling lies, and Miss Marple intended to find them. Chapter 2. Shadows in the Rose Garden? The rain had cleared by morning, leaving the gardens of Gossington Hall glistening under a pale May sun. Miss Marple arrived shortly after 10 o'clock, accompanied by Inspector Craddock, who had very wisely decided that the old lady's presence might loosen tongues where official questions would not. Mrs. Violet Blake received them in the morning room, her hands trembling slightly as she poured coffee from a delicate spode pot. "I hardly know what to believe any more," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Harold told me Lady Edith was an old benefactor, nothing more. Yet those papers, that marriage certificate with her name, it can't be true. We were married in 1950 at Marylebone Registry Office. I have the certificate myself." Miss Marple accepted her cup with a gentle nod, her eyes taking in every detail, the dark circles under Violet's eyes, the way she kept glancing towards the French windows that opened onto the rose garden, and the faint scent of expensive French perfume that seemed at odds with her simple morning dress. "People do sometimes lead rather complicated lives, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "Especially gentlemen who have made their own fortunes. Tell me, had your husband been worried about anything lately? Apart from the biscuit tin, of course." Violet hesitated. "There were letters. He burned most of them, but I found one in the grate. It was from Switzerland, signed simply. It said, 'The past is never dead. Come to terms, or I shall come to you.' He laughed it off, said it was some mad old woman who once knew his mother. But after the tin arrived, he changed. He locked the study door, and I heard him talking to himself. Something about double indemnity and the wrong tin." Inspector Craddock leaned forward. "The wrong tin, Mrs. Blake?" She nodded. "Those were his exact words when I knocked. They've sent the wrong one, Vi. God help us." Miss Marple's knitting needles had appeared as if by magic. Click, click. How very significant. One tin for your husband, one for me, both containing carefully selected lies. The question is, who benefits from spreading these particular falsehoods? They moved into the library. The chalk outline had been cleaned, but the atmosphere remained heavy. Miss Marple examined the desk carefully. In the top drawer, hidden beneath a stack of factory accounts, she found a small key attached to a label that read, "Tin number 3, do not open." "Inspector," she murmured, "I believe we should find this third tin before someone else does." While Craddock questioned the staff, Miss Marple wandered into the rose garden. Old habits died hard. She had solved more than one mystery among flower beds and garden paths. The new gardener, a surly man named Higgs, was pruning roses with rather more force than necessary. "Been here long, Higgs?" she asked pleasantly. 3 weeks, ma'am." "Mr. Blake hired me from London. Said he wanted proper English roses, not them fancy foreign ones." He spat on the ground. "Funny business, this. House feels wrong, like it's got secrets in the walls." Miss Marple bent to examine a particularly fine Madame Butterfly rose. "And did you ever see Lady Edith when she visited?" Higgs's shears paused. "Never saw the lady herself. But there was an old woman came the night before Mr. Blake died. Arrived after dark in a hired car. Stayed 20 minutes, no more. Left a parcel. The same sort of tin, I reckon. I saw it through the study window." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Could you describe her?" "Veiled. Tallish. Walked with a stick but moved quick enough when she wanted. Sounded posh, like the old gentry." Back inside, Inspector Craddock had gathered the household. There was the butler, Rogers, who had come with the Blakes from Manchester, the nervous young maid Rose, the cook Mrs. Harmon, and a secretary, Mr. Anthony Ferrars, a sleek, good-looking man of 35 who handled Mr. Blake's business correspondence. Ferrars spoke smoothly. Mr. Blake was expanding aggressively. He planned to turn part of the grounds into a modern factory wing. Lady Edith, if she was still alive, would have hated that. She always said Gossington should remain a gentleman's estate. Miss Bull smiled vaguely. "You knew Lady Edith, Mr. Ferrars?" A slight pause.
"Only by reputation, Miss Marple. I handled some legal papers for Mr. Blake regarding the purchase of the hall."
There were complications with the title because of Lady Edith's annuity rights. That afternoon, Miss Marple took tea at the vicarage again. Griselda was bubbling with gossip. Rose told the butcher's boy that Mr. Blake shouted at someone on the telephone the night he died. "Something about you're supposed to be dead, and I paid you enough." Then he slammed the receiver down. Miss Marple's expression remained mild, but her mind was working rapidly. Paid. The notebook in her tin had contained several large sums paid to the initials EC over the years. Later, in the privacy of her own sitting room, she spread out the contents of both tins. The love letters to Edith were forgeries. She was almost certain. The handwriting varied too cleverly, as if someone had copied different samples. The share certificates were genuine enough, but the marriage certificate between Harold and Edith had a tiny flaw in the official seal. A clever forgery, but a forgery nonetheless. The real question was why? Why go to such elaborate lengths to torment a successful businessman? The telephone rang. It was Inspector Craddock. "Miss Marple, we've found tin number 3. It was hidden in the wine cellar, and there's been another development. Anthony Ferrars has disappeared. Took the afternoon train to London, apparently. But more importantly, the tin contains photographs, very compromising ones, of Harold Blake and a much younger woman who looks remarkably like Violet Blake. Dated 1947, 3 years before their marriage." Miss Marple was silent for a moment. "And the woman in the photographs, Inspector?" "According to a note in the tin, her name was Edith Crawley, Jr., Lady Edith's niece, who supposedly died in a boating accident in 1948. Miss Marple looked out at her peaceful garden, where the evening light was turning golden. "2 Ediths," she said softly. "One supposedly dead in Switzerland, one supposedly dead in a boating accident, and both very much involved with Mr. Blake. Lies upon lies, Inspector, and I fear we are only seeing the top layer of the tin." She did not tell him about the faint footprint she had noticed in the rose garden that morning, a woman's shoe, size 6, with a distinctive crisscross pattern on the sole, the same pattern she had seen pressed into the soft earth near her own garden gate the previous evening. Someone had been watching Dame Mead. As she prepared for bed that night, Miss Marple locked the biscuit tin in her writing desk and placed a small silver crucifix on top of it. A habit from her youth. She doubted it would stop a determined murderer, but it gave her a sense of order. Somewhere in the darkness between St. Mary Mead and Gossington Hall, the real Edith, whichever one she was moving. And Miss Marple had the distinct feeling that the next tin to be opened would contain something far more dangerous than papers. It might contain murder itself. Chapter 3. The Veiled Lady of the Night Train. The following morning dawned grey and chilly, typical of an English spring that could not quite decide whether to bless or curse the villagers of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, wrapped in her warmest shawl, was already in the garden examining the suspicious footprint near her gate when Dr. Haydock's familiar old Morris pulled up. "Jane, You look far too alert for a woman who should be resting after yesterday's excitement, the doctor grumbled as he climbed out. I've just come from Gossington. Another nasty business. The new maid, Rose, found Anthony Ferris's body in the summer house early this morning. Strangled with a silk scarf. Gentleman's, by the look of it. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-stitch. How very sad and how very convenient for someone. Mr. Ferrars knew too much, I suspect. Did he have a biscuit tin with him by any chance? Haydock gave her a sharp look. As a matter of fact, there was one empty, lying beside him. Same hunting scene on the lid. Inspector Craddock is furious. He thinks the killer is playing games with us. By 11 o'clock, Miss Marple was once again at Gossington Hall. The summer house, a pretty white wooden structure half hidden by wisteria, now wore a far more sinister air. Inspector Craddock met her with a tired smile and a sheaf of notes. Ferrars was hit on the head first, then strangled. The scarf had initials HB, Harold Blake. The tin contained only one thing. A single photograph of Ferrars himself standing with a young woman outside a registry office. The date on the back is 1949. The woman is clearly Lady Edith Crawley, or someone pretending to be her. Miss Marple studied the summer house carefully. A faint trace of expensive French perfume lingered in the air, the same scent she had noticed on Mrs. Violet Blake. Interesting. Inspector, has anyone checked the railway station? Mr. Ferrars was supposed to have taken the afternoon train to London yesterday. Craddock nodded. He bought a ticket but never boarded. The ticket collector remembers him arguing with an old woman in a heavy veil on the platform. The woman carried a walking stick and spoke with an upper-class accent. She handed him something small, a tin, possibly. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. The veiled lady again. Higgs the gardener saw her the night Mr. Blake died. She seems remarkably active for a woman who is supposed to be dead in Switzerland.
They returned to the house where Violet Blake sat pale and rigid in the drawing room. Her hands clutched a small handkerchief edged with lace.
I swear I never met Anthony Ferrars before we came to Gossington, she said defensively. He was just Harold's secretary. But Harold did mention once that Ferrars had been useful in sorting out old entanglements. I thought he meant business matters. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea and asked gently, My dear, that perfume you wear, Lure Blue, isn't it? Rather expensive for these days. Had Mr. Blake given you a bottle recently? Violet looked startled. No, I've worn it for years. It was a gift from my aunt, actually, just before I met Harold. The afternoon brought more revelations. Miss Marple visited the local solicitor, Mr. Petherick, an old friend. Over sherry and biscuits, plain ones, thankfully, he produced some dusty documents. The sale of Gossington was most irregular, Jane. Lady Edith retained a life interest in certain rooms in the rose garden. Yet Mr. Blake's lawyers somehow bypassed that. I always suspected bribery, but could prove nothing. And here's something curious. He handed her a faded photograph. Lady Edith's niece, Edith Jr., taken in 1947. Remarkable resemblance to young Mrs. Blake, don't you think? Miss Marple studied the picture. The same delicate features, the same anxious eyes. Almost identical, she murmured. Lies, Mr. Petherick. Someone has been reshaping the past like a potter with clay. That evening, Miss Marple took the 6:45 train to the nearby market town of Much Benham. She had a theory to test. The station master, old Mr. Simmons, remembered the veiled lady well. Came in on the 4:12 from London 2 days ago, miss. Left on the last train back that same night. Gave me a sovereign tip, very generous. Spoke like quality, but her gloves were worn at the fingers. Old money that's running thin, if you ask me. Miss Marple returned to St. Mary Mead by the last train. As she walked the short distance from the station, she felt eyes upon her. Footsteps, light, careful, followed at a distance. She paused by the churchyard wall, pretending to adjust her hat. The footsteps stopped too. When she reached Danemed, she found her front door slightly ajar. Heart beating faster, she entered cautiously. The drawing room was untouched, but the writing desk had been forced open. The biscuit tin was gone, yet on the table lay a new tin, smaller, newer, with a label that read, "Assorted creams, fresh today." Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small vial of clear liquid. The paper said, "Miss Marple, stop meddling. The tins contain only what people deserve." Blake paid for his sins. Ferrers knew too much. "You have 24 hours to return to your knitting, or the next tin will be for you." A friend of the truth. The vial smelled faintly of bitter almonds. Miss Marple sat down heavily in her favorite chair. For the first time in many years, she felt a genuine chill. Not of fear exactly, but of recognition. This was no ordinary village murder. This was a carefully orchestrated revenge woven over years, using lies as weapons and biscuit tins as messengers. She picked up the telephone and called Inspector Craddock. "Another tin has arrived, Inspector. And this time the threat is personal. I believe we should look for a woman who walks with a stick but doesn't need one, who wears Le Bleu perfume, and who has excellent reasons to hate both Harold Blake and anyone connected to Gossington Hall." Craddock's voice was tense. "We've just had the post-mortem on Ferrers. He had a note in his pocket. Tin number 4 is the last, but we haven't found tin number 4 yet." Miss Marple looked at the new tin on her table. "I rather think, Inspector," she said quietly, "that tin number 4 has just arrived, and someone is getting desperate." Outside, in the darkness of the lane, a veiled figure stood watching the lighted window of Mead. The figure's hand tightened on a walking stick that was, in fact, quite unnecessary. The game of lies was entering its most dangerous phase. Chapter 4. The fourth tin and the forgotten niece. The church clock in St. Mary Mead struck midnight as Miss Marple sat motionless in her drawing room. The new biscuit tin and the suspicious vial placed carefully on a lace doily. She had not touched the liquid again. One did not need Dr. Haydock to recognize the faint odor of bitter almonds, prussic acid, or something very like it. A deadly gift indeed. Dawn found her already dressed and seated at her writing desk composing a careful letter. At 8 o'clock, she sent young Fred the postman with 2 notes, one to Inspector Craddock at the Blue Boar Inn, and another to Mrs. Violet Blake at Gossington Hall, inviting her for morning coffee to discuss the rose garden arrangements. Inspector Craddock arrived first, looking as though he had slept little. He examined the vial with a grim expression. "We'll have this analyzed immediately. The threat is clear now, Miss Marple. You should really consider staying with the Clements for a few days." Miss Marple smiled gently. "That would be most inconvenient, Inspector. How can one observe the village from the vicarage? No, I shall remain here. But I would be grateful if you could discover everything possible about Lady Edith's niece, the one who supposedly drowned in 1948. By 10 o'clock, Violet Blake arrived, escorted by a nervous Rogers the butler. She looked even more fragile in the morning light, her fair hair pulled back severely. "You wanted to see me about the roses, Miss Marple?" "Among other things, my dear." Miss Marple poured coffee with steady hands. "Tell me about your life before you met Mr. Blake. You were a secretary, I believe?" Violet's cup rattled slightly in its saucer. "Yes. I worked for a small publishing firm in London. My aunt helped me get the position after my parents died." "And your aunt's name?" A long pause. Edith Llewellyn." She preferred to be called Lady Crawley after her marriage. Miss Marple's blue eyes remained kind but unwavering. "The same Lady Edith who is supposed to have died in Switzerland 3 weeks ago. The same woman who has been seen veiled at railway stations and in this very village." Violet's face lost all color. "I don't know what you mean. My aunt and I were never close. She disapproved of my marriage to Harold. She said he was beneath us." Inspector Craddock, who had been waiting in the next room, stepped in quietly. "Mrs. Blake, We have a warrant to search your personal belongings at Gossington. We found something disturbing in Anthony Ferris's London lodgings this morning. A diary. It mentions that Violet Blake and Edith Crawley Jr. are the same person. The silence that followed was absolute. Violet, or Edith, covered her face with her hands. "It's true," she whispered at last. "I am Edith Llewellyn Crawley's niece. My parents died when I was 20. Aunt Edith paid for everything but controlled my life completely. When I met Harold in 1947, we fell in love. But Aunt Edith forbade the marriage. She wanted me to marry a titled man to restore the family fortunes, so we eloped secretly. Harold paid a clerk to create new papers for me as Violet Marsden. We lived quietly until Aunt Edith somehow discovered the truth in 1950. She threatened to ruin us unless Harold bought Gossington Hall for her and gave her a large annuity." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And the biscuit tins? Aunt Edith's idea of revenge. She loved symbolic gestures. She said she would bury him in lies the way he had buried her reputation. Harold paid her for years to keep silent. When she supposedly died in Switzerland, we thought we were finally free. Then the first tin arrived." Inspector Craddock's voice was stern. "So you had motive to kill your husband, Mrs. Blake, or should I say Mrs. Blake Crawley?" "I did not kill him," she cried. "I was terrified of Aunt Edith, not Harold. He was trying to protect me." Miss Marple rose and fetched the fourth tin from her desk. "This arrived last night with a threat. Inside was the vial. But there was also this." She drew out a small, yellowed cutting from a Swiss newspaper announcing Lady Edith's death. Someone had written across it in red ink, "Liar. She never left England." The rest of the day was spent in careful investigation. Craddock's men searched the attics at Gossington and found a locked trunk containing several identical biscuit tins, stacks of forged documents, and a collection of wigs and veiled hats. One walking stick had a hidden compartment that still smelled faintly of the French perfume L'Heure Bleue. In the late afternoon, Miss Marple and the inspector visited the old boathouse at the lake where Edith Jr. was said to have drowned. The wooden structure was rotting, but fresh footprints, women's size 6 crisscross pattern, were visible in the mud. "She never died here," Miss Marple said softly. "The whole accident was staged. 2 women playing one identity when convenient. But which one is the veiled lady now? The aunt or the niece?" As they returned to the village, a telegram arrived for Inspector Craddock at the police station. It was from Scotland Yard. "Body of elderly woman identified as Lady Edith Crawley found in empty house near Kensington. Died approximately 4 weeks ago, strangled. Swiss death certificate proven false." Miss Marple folded the telegram neatly. "So the real Lady Edith has been dead much longer than we thought. The woman we are looking for is the niece, Violet Blake, pretending to be her own aunt in the Vale. Or perhaps someone else entirely. The tins were sent by the living to torment the living." That night, as Miss Marple prepared a simple supper of bread and cheese, the telephone rang. It was Rose, the maid from Gossington, sounding terrified. "Miss Marple, please come quick. I found tin number 5 in Mrs. Blake's wardrobe. It's full of letters. Love letters between Mrs. Blake and Mr. Ferrars. And there's a pistol with it." Miss Marple put down the receiver slowly. The layers of lies were multiplying like weeds in an untended garden. Jealousy, bigamy, forged deaths, and now perhaps a second murder. She took her warmest coat and her sturdiest umbrella. As she stepped out into the dark lane, she heard the unmistakable sound of a woman's footsteps retreating swiftly into the shadows. The veiled lady, or her double, was still very much alive, and very dangerous. Chapter 5. The Scent of Bitter Almonds, the Night Air Instant. Mary Mead carried a sharp chill as Miss Marple made her way towards Gossington Hall, her umbrella held firmly like a sword. Rose's frantic telephone call had left no room for hesitation. The village streets were empty, but she felt the weight of unseen eyes once more. Halfway along the lane, she paused beneath an old oak and listened. Nothing but the rustle of leaves, yet the crisscross footprint in the soft earth near the stile told its own story. Rogers the butler met her at the door, his face ashen. "Thank goodness you've come, madam. Mrs. Blake is in a terrible state." She found the tin herself this time. In the blue drawing room, Violet Blake, Edith Crawley Jr., sat huddled by the fire, a half-empty glass of brandy trembling in her hand. The 5th biscuit tin lay open on the walnut table. Inside were bundles of passionate love letters, all addressed to my dearest Tony, and signed Edith. The handwriting matched Violet's perfectly. Beside them rested a small silver pistol, recently cleaned, with one bullet missing. "I didn't write these," Violet cried as Miss Marple entered. "The perfume on them is mine. The paper is mine, but the words. I never loved Anthony Ferrers. He was Harold's man, always watching, always hinting that he knew my real name." Miss Marple picked up one letter with a handkerchief and read a passage aloud in her gentle voice. "Harold grows more tiresome every day. When he is gone, we shall be free. Remember the plan we made by the lake in '48. Your Edith," she set it down carefully. "A most convincing forgery. My dear, someone knows you very well indeed. Someone who has had access to your personal stationery and perfume for some time." Inspector Craddock arrived within the hour, summoned by telephone. His expression darkened when he saw the pistol. "Ballistics will tell us soon enough if this fired the shot that killed anyone, but the timing is suspicious. Ferrers was strangled, not shot." While Craddock questioned Violet in the library, Miss Marple slipped upstairs with Rose's guidance. The maid's room was small but neat. Rose herself was a thin, sharp-eyed girl of 19. "I swear I saw Mrs. Blake go out last night, miss," Rose whispered. "Wearing that heavy veil and carrying a stick. She returned near midnight. Then this morning the tin appeared in her wardrobe like magic." Miss Marple patted the girl's hand. "You have been most observant, Rose. Tell me, did Mr. Blake ever receive visitors from London whom he kept secret from his wife?" Rose hesitated, then nodded. "A gentleman came twice. Foreign-sounding name, something like Keller or Kello. Tall, thin, with a scar on his cheek. They talked in the study about the Swiss arrangements and money. Lots of money. By dawn, the household was in uproar. Doctor. Haydock had been called again, this time for Violet Blake, who had collapsed after drinking her morning tea. "Poison," the doctor announced grimly in the hall. "Not enough to kill, but enough to frighten. Bitter almonds again. Someone is playing a very nasty game."
Miss Marple sat beside the sleeping Violet and examined the half-drunk cup. A faint residue clung to the bottom.
"The same person who sent me the vial," she murmured. "But why warn me, and then attempt to poison her? Unless the intention was never to kill outright, but to confuse and divide." Later that morning, Inspector Craddock brought news from London. The real Lady Edith Crawley was murdered in Kensington 4 weeks ago. The landlady identified her from a photograph, but said a younger woman had visited her frequently, always veiled. The younger woman paid the rent in cash. Miss Marple nodded. The niece impersonating the aunt when necessary. But who is impersonating the niece now? A telegram arrived during luncheon. It was from Scotland Yard's handwriting expert. Letters in tin number 5 show 2 distinct hands. One matches Violet Blake. The other is unknown but shows strong similarities. Forger is skilled and left-handed. Miss Marple put down her spoon. Left-handed. How very significant. She spent the afternoon in the rose garden where the veiled lady had been seen. The new gardener, Higgs, was unusually talkative today. "Funny thing, Ma'am, I found this buried shallow under the Madame Butterfly roses yesterday." He held out a small leather notebook, the same one that had been in Miss Marple's original biscuit tin. Pages had been torn out, but several remained with columns of figures and the initials EC and HB and newly added AF and VB blackmail, Miss Marple said softly. Mr. Blake was paying not just Lady Edith but others. And someone has been adding names to the ledger after his death. That evening, as shadows lengthened across Gossington Hall, Miss Marple gathered several people in the library. Violet, now recovered but weak, Rogers, Rose, Higgs, and the local solicitor, Mr. Petherick. She spoke quietly, but with steel beneath the gentleness. This entire tragedy began not with Mr. Blake's death, but years earlier when two ambitious people decided to fake a death by the lake. Edith Jr. and Harold Blake staged the boating accident so that she could escape her aunt's control and later reappear as Violet. But the real Lady Edith discovered the deception. She demanded money and the house. When Harold tried to break free by claiming she had died in Switzerland, using a forged certificate, the real Lady Edith was murdered in London. Violet's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't kill my aunt. I hated her, but I didn't kill her," Miss Marple continued. "The biscuit tins were Lady Edith's revenge from beyond the grave, or rather, someone carrying out her final plan, someone who knew all the secrets, someone left-handed, someone who wears Lure Blue and size 6 shoes." Every eye turned towards Violet, but Miss Marple shook her head. "No, not you, my dear. You have been cleverly framed. The real danger is the one person who has moved freely between London and St. Mary Mead, who had access to all the papers, and who benefited from both Harold's death and Ferrer's silence." She turned slowly towards the butler, Rogers. "You came with Mr. Blake from Manchester, Rogers. But your real name is Reginald Keller, is it not? Left-handed. And you have a scar on your left cheek, which you cover with stage makeup. You were the man who helped forge the Swiss death certificate. When Lady Edith threatened to expose everything, you killed her in Kensington. Then you continued sending the tins to destroy Harold and claim the fortune for yourself, perhaps with a share for the real forger." Rogers smiled coldly and reached into his jacket. Before anyone could move, he had the silver pistol pointed at Miss Marple. "Clever old woman," he said in a very different voice. "But you're too late. Tin number 6 will be the last one, and it contains the truth about who really owns Gossington Hall now." A shot rang out. Chapter 6. The shot in the library. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the oak-paneled library of Gossington Hall, like a thunderclap from the past. For one terrible second everyone froze. Then Rogers staggered backwards, a look of utter astonishment on his face. The silver pistol clattered to the Persian rug. A red stain spread across his left shoulder. Inspector Craddock stood in the doorway, his service revolver still raised. "Drop it, Keller, or Rogers, or whatever your name is. It's over." Miss Marple remained perfectly calm in her armchair, though her hands had tightened on her knitting. "Thank you, Inspector. Your timing was most precise. I rather thought you might be listening at the door, as I suggested." Rogers, Keller, sank into a chair, pressing a handkerchief to his wound, his face twisted with pain and fury. "You meddling old witch," he snarled. "You know nothing. Nothing." Violet Blake stared at her butler in horror. "Rogers, you killed Harold? You killed Ferrers? But why?" Miss Marple spoke gently, as though discussing the weather over afternoon tea. "Not quite everything, my dear. Shall we unravel the next layer of this very deceptive tin?" She rose and walked to the fireplace, her eyes missing nothing. "Mr. Keller here was more than a mere butler. He was Harold Blake's partner in the early days of the Biscuit factory, a silent partner. When Harold decided to go respectable and marry into the gentry, he tried to cut Keller out. That was when the blackmail began. The biscuit tins were originally Lady Edith's idea, but Keller perfected the method after he murdered her in Kensington. Craddock's men entered and began tending to the wounded man while the inspector searched him. From Roger's inner pocket came a small key in a 6th biscuit tin unopened. "Tin number 6, Miss Marple murmured. "The one he threatened us with." The tin was opened under careful supervision. Inside lay a properly executed will, dated only 10 days earlier, leaving the entire Blake fortune and Gossington Hall to my loyal friend and companion, Reginald Keller, in gratitude for years of faithful service. Attached was a marriage certificate, forged, of course, between Harold Blake and a woman named Violet Keller, supposedly performed in secret in Manchester. Violet gave a choked laugh that was half sob. He was going to make it look as though I was never legally married to Harold at all. Miss Marple nodded. Precisely. And with you discredited or perhaps eliminated, Keller would inherit everything. The love letters between you and Ferrers were forged by him. He is left-handed, you see, and the forger was left-handed. He had access to your perfume, your stationery, even your wardrobe. He was the one wearing the veil and using the walking stick, impersonating the resurrected Lady Edith to frighten everyone. Rogers Keller laughed bitterly despite his pain. Blake deserved it. He cheated me out of thousands. When the old lady, real Lady Edith, found out about the faked drowning and started demanding more money, I dealt with her. Then Blake panicked and wanted to confess everything. Couldn't have that. Dr. Haydock arrived shortly afterwards and attended to the prisoner. While the doctor worked, Miss Marple drew Inspector Craddock and Violet aside near the French windows. "There is still one piece missing," she said quietly. "The real forger of the more delicate documents. Keller is clever, but not artistic enough for some of those love letters. Someone with a finer hand helped him. Someone who knew the Crawley family intimately." Violet's face paled again. "You don't mean?" At that moment, Rose the maid entered with a fresh pot of tea, her hands unusually steady. Miss Marple watched her pour with sharp eyes. "Thank you, Rose. Or should I say, Miss Edith Llewellyn, the real niece." The room fell silent once more. Rose Edith set the teapot down with a small, elegant smile that transformed her entire face. Gone was the nervous village girl. In her place stood a young woman with cold, intelligent eyes. "You really are remarkable, Miss Marple," she said softly. "I thought the maid disguise was perfect." Violet stared at the girl she had known as Rose. "But you were my maid. I hired you 3 weeks ago." "You hired the real Rose," the young woman corrected. "She is currently enjoying a nice holiday in Bournemouth with money I gave her. I took her place the day after I killed my aunt in London. It was easy. No one ever looks closely at servants." Miss Marple clicked her tongue. "The crisscross footprints. The Lure blue perfume you couldn't resist wearing even in disguise. The left-handed forgeries you helped create. You and Keller were partners from the beginning. You hated your aunt for controlling your life. You hated Harold for using you and then trying to discard the scandal. So you both decided to destroy him slowly with the tins full of lies, then kill him and Ferrers when they became dangerous." Keller groaned from his chair. "Shut up, you little fool!" But the false Rose continued, almost proudly. "The tins were beautiful, weren't they? Each one a lie more delicious than the last. We even sent one to you, Miss Marple, because we knew you'd come poking around. We wanted an audience for our performance." Inspector Craddock moved to arrest her, but the young woman suddenly snatched the silver pistol from the floor where it had fallen. She backed towards the French windows. "Don't come any closer. I still have one bullet left, the one meant for Violet if everything else failed." Miss Marple spoke with calm authority. "My dear, it is finished. The village is surrounded. Inspector Craddock's men have been watching the house for hours, and I suspect that vial you sent me contained nothing but colored water. You wanted to frighten, not kill outright. You are not a natural murderer like Mr. Keller." For a moment the girl's hand wavered. Then, with a cry of rage, she threw the pistol aside and tried to run into the garden. 2 constables caught her before she reached the rose beds. As she was led away, still struggling, Miss Marple looked sadly at the open biscuit tin on the table. "So many lies," she said quietly, "and in the end, the truth was far simpler than the deception. Greed, revenge, and two wicked hearts working together. Violet Blake sank into a chair, weeping with relief and exhaustion. "What happens now, Miss Marple?" "Now, my dear," Miss Marple replied, picking up her knitting once more, "we let justice take its proper course, and perhaps plant some new roses in that garden. The old ones have seen rather too much." Outside, the spring night was quiet again, but in the attics of Gossington Hall, Inspector Craddock's men would later find tin No. 7 still sealed, containing the final confession and a map to where the real rose was safely hidden. The biscuit tin full of lies had finally been emptied. Chapter 7. The 7th tin, the arrest of Rogers, or Keller, and the false rose sent ripples of shock through St. Mary Mead that refused to settle. By the next afternoon, the village green buzzed with whispered conversations outside the post office and the Blue Boar. Mrs. Harmon, the cook at Gossington, had already given 3 different versions of the library confrontation to anyone who would listen. Miss Marple sat once again in her own drawing room, the 7th biscuit tin resting unopened on the table before her. Inspector Craddock had brought it personally that morning, found sealed in the false rose's luggage. "You were right about almost everything, Miss Marple," he said, stirring sugar into his tea. "Keller has confessed to killing Lady Edith in Kensington and to strangling Ferrars. The girl, Edith Llewellyn, admits to helping forge the documents and sending most of the tins, but she swears she didn't poison Mr. Blake. Claims Keller acted alone there." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "And do you believe her, Inspector?" Craddock frowned. "I'm not sure. The post-mortem on Blake showed cyanide in his port. Keller had access, but the girl knew the household routines better. She could have slipped it in easily." Miss Marple set her knittings aside and carefully broke the seal on tin number 7. Inside lay a single thick envelope and a small velvet box. The envelope contained a letter written in a firm, educated hand, the real Lady Edith's handwriting dated 2 weeks before her murder. "To whom it may concern, if this tin has reached Miss Jane Marple or the police, then I am dead, and my wretched niece and that scoundrel Keller have succeeded in part. Harold Blake was my creation. I financed his factory. He repaid me by seducing my niece and faking her death. I forced him to buy Gossington and pay dearly for silence. But Keller has been stealing from the factory for years. There is a second set of books. Find them, and you will see the full extent of the conspiracy." The velvet box contained a key and a small slip of paper, safe behind the 3rd portrait in the long gallery. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with interest. "How very thoughtful of Lady Edith. Even in death, she continues to direct the play." An hour later, they stood in the long gallery at Gossington Hall. Violet Blake, still pale but composed, watched as Craddock removed the 3rd portrait, a rather gloomy oil painting of a Victorian Crawley ancestor. Behind it was a small wall safe. The key fitted perfectly. Inside lay leather-bound ledgers, bundles of letters, and another smaller tin. Tin number 8, still sealed. Craddock opened the ledgers. His whistle was low and appreciative. Blake was cooking the books on a grand scale. But look here. Keller was taking even more, hundreds of thousands over the years. No wonder he wanted Blake dead. Violet sank into a chair. "Harold never told me any of this. He said the factory was doing well, that we could finally live peacefully here." Miss Marple picked up one of the old letters. It was from Harold Blake to Lady Edith, written in 1948, promising marriage to the niece in exchange for financial help. Another letter, much later, showed Blake begging for more time to pay. "The lies were not all on one side," Miss Marple observed gently. "Everyone in this sad affair was playing their own game. But I wonder—" She turned to the smaller tin. Breaking its seal revealed something entirely unexpected, a signed confession by Anthony Ferrars, dated the day before his death. In it, Ferrars admitted helping Keller murder Lady Edith, and stated that Violet Blake had known about the plan and approved it. Violet's voice rose in protest. "That's a lie. I knew nothing about my aunt's murder." Miss Marple studied the confession carefully, then compared it to samples of Ferrers's genuine handwriting from the study desk. "The signature is his," she said at last, "but the handwriting of the body of the document is not. Another forgery, and a rather desperate one." That evening, Miss Marple took a solitary walk in the rose garden. The air was sweet with the scent of early blooms. She stopped near the Madame Butterfly bush, where the notebook had been buried. Something about the case still troubled her. A small, discordant note in an otherwise neat symphony of deceit. Dr. Haydock found her there. "Jane, you look pensive. Not like you to be worried after catching 2 murderers." "Perhaps because I haven't caught the real one yet," she replied softly. "Keller and the girl are guilty of many things, but I believe Mr. Blake's actual murder was committed by someone else. Someone who has remained almost invisible." Haydock raised his eyebrows. "Who?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she asked, "Did you ever treat Lady Edith for her heart condition in the past?" "Once or twice years ago. Strong woman, nerves of steel. Strange that she should die by strangulation rather than poison. She always feared poisoning." "Exactly," Miss Marple murmured. Later that night, as rain began to fall softly on the roof of Danmed, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Mr. Petherick, the solicitor, arrived looking unusually agitated. "Miss Marple, I feel I must tell you something. After the sale of Gossington, I received a large anonymous payment into my firm's account, with instructions to hold certain documents. They concern a child, a son born to Harold Blake and a woman in Manchester in 1946, long before he met Violet." Miss Marple's expression did not change. "And the mother?" "Deceased. But the boy would now be about 10 years old. The documents give him claim to the entire estate if Blake died without legitimate issue." The grandfather clock ticked heavily in the silence. "So there is a third heir," Miss Marple said, "and someone has been very careful to keep his existence hidden. The biscuit tins were not only weapons of revenge, they were also distractions, Mr." Petherick left shortly afterwards. Miss Marple locked her doors and windows with extra care. She placed tin No, ate on her bedside table, and lay awake long into the night. Somewhere in England, a 10-year-old boy perhaps slept peacefully, unaware that his very existence had set in motion a chain of murders and magnificent lies. And someone still free, was determined to secure his inheritance by any means necessary. The next morning, a new parcel arrived by special messenger. It was another biscuit tin. This one was larger, heavier, and addressed simply, "For Miss Jane Marple, the final truth." Attached was a single rose from the Gossington garden, its stem carefully stripped of thorns. Miss Marple did not open it immediately. She knew that some tins should only be opened in the presence of witnesses, and perhaps a policeman with a revolver. The game was far from over. Chapter 8. The boy from Manchester, the morning of May 23rd, 1952, dawned bright and deceptively peaceful over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple had scarcely slept, her mind turning over the implications of the hidden heir, like a particularly difficult piece of knitting. At precisely 9 o'clock, Inspector Craddock arrived with 2 constables and a look of grim determination. "I've brought reinforcements, Miss Marple. That new tin looks heavier than the others. We'll open it in the garden, in full daylight." They gathered around the white wrought-iron table beneath the apple tree. The large biscuit tin, its hunting scenes now familiar and almost sinister, sat between them. Miss Marple carefully cut the string and lifted the lid. Inside were no papers this time. Instead, there was a child's silver christening mug engraved with the name Reginald Harold Blake, a lock of fair hair tied with blue ribbon, and a birth certificate dated 12th March 1946. The mother was listed as one Mrs. Margaret Keller, widow. At the bottom of the tin lay a photograph of a solemn little boy of about 10,
standing beside a man who was unmistakably a younger Harold Blake.
Craddock exhaled sharply. So the boy exists. Petherick was right. Miss Marple picked up the christening mug and turned it slowly in her hands. Reginald. Named after Reginald Keller, no doubt. The boy is Keller's nephew by blood, but Blake's son by law, with Violet's marriage potentially invalid due to the forged documents. This child could inherit everything. A small folded note had been tucked beneath the photograph. The handwriting was neat, almost schoolmasterly. Miss Marple, the lies have served their purpose. Blake's legitimate son will claim his birthright. Those who stand in the way will join the others. The 8th tin is mercy. The 9th will be justice, no signature. But the paper carried the faintest trace of Le Bleu. Someone is still playing the game, Miss Marple said softly. And this person has access to very personal items from years ago. They drove to Gossington Hall immediately. Violet Blake met them in the morning room, looking utterly drained. When shown the photograph of the boy, she gave a small, broken laugh. Harold told me there had been someone before me. A brief affair during the war. He said the woman died and there was no child. More lies. Inspector Craddock cleared his throat. Mrs. Blake, we need to know if you ever met this boy or heard his name. Never. She hesitated. But Rogers, Keller, once received a letter from a Manchester school. He burned it immediately, but I saw the envelope. I thought it was factory business. Miss Marple wandered over to the French windows overlooking the rose garden. The mastermind has been remarkably patient. The tins were not merely revenge. They were a slow campaign to discredit everyone connected to the estate, so that when the final claimant appeared, no one would question his right.
A commotion in the hall interrupted them. Young Fred the postman had arrived with an urgent telegram for Inspector Craddock. He read it aloud.
Boy identified. Reginald Blake, age 10, pupil at St. Christopher's School, Manchester. Removed from school 4 days ago by man claiming to be his uncle. Headmaster concerned. Police searching. Miss Marple's expression grew grave. 4 days ago. That was the day after Mr. Ferrars was killed. The boy is already in someone's hands. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Craddock coordinated with Manchester police, while Miss Marple interviewed the remaining staff at Gossington. The cook, Mrs. Harmon, remembered something useful over a strong cup of tea in the kitchen. Rogers used to go to Manchester every other month on business, he called it. Always brought back sweets for his sister's boy. I thought it was odd. But servants learn not to ask questions. By late afternoon, a new development arrived. A local farmer reported seeing a woman and a young boy near the old quarry 2 miles from the village the previous evening. The woman had been veiled and carried a walking stick. The false rose is in custody, Craddock said. So who is this new veiled lady? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Perhaps the same one. Or perhaps we have been chasing shadows while the real hand moved quietly behind us. That evening, Miss Marple insisted on visiting the quarry herself, accompanied by the inspector and Dr. Haydock. The sun was setting as they reached the overgrown site. In the soft earth near the edge they found fresh footprints. Women's size 6, crisscross pattern, and a small tin biscuit box lying open and empty. Inside the lid, scratched with a nail, were the words, "The boy is safe for now. Come alone tomorrow at dusk, Miss Marple, if you wish to know the final truth. Bring no police." Miss Marple looked at the message for a long time. Very clever. They know I cannot resist. Craddock protested vigorously. It's obviously a trap. We'll surround the area. No, Inspector, Miss Marple said firmly. If we frighten them, the boy may disappear forever. Or worse, I shall go, but not entirely alone. I have my own small precautions. As they drove back through the gathering twilight, Miss Marple remained unusually silent. In her mind, the pieces were slowly forming a complete picture. The real murderer of Harold Blake had not been Keller or the false rose. That final act of poisoning had required intimate knowledge of Blake's habits and a cold willingness to watch him die. Only one person had moved through the entire story like a ghost, trusted, overlooked, always present yet never suspected. Back at Mead, Miss Marple prepared carefully for the meeting at the quarry. She placed her late brother's old service revolver, a relic from the Great War, into her capacious handbag. She also took her knitting, because one never knew when calm hands might be needed. Before retiring, she wrote 2 letters, one to Inspector Craddock to be delivered at dawn, and one to the vicar's wife Griselda. As she sealed the second envelope, she murmured to herself, "So many lies in one biscuit tin, but the final lie will be the most dangerous of all." Outside her window, in the darkness of the lane, a small figure stood watching the lighted window, a boy's figure, and beside him, the silhouette of a woman whose face remained hidden beneath a heavy veil. The 9th tin was waiting. Chapter 9. The Quarry at Dusk. The sun was sinking behind the hills like a reluctant witness when Miss Marple approached the old quarry. The place had a bad reputation in St. Mary Mead. Children were forbidden to play there after a tragic accident in 1937. Now, in the long shadows of evening, it felt like the perfect stage for the final act of a drama soaked in lies. She walked steadily, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path, handbag heavy with her brother's old revolver and a small torch. Inspector Craddock had reluctantly agreed to stay hidden with 2 men on the far ridge, but Miss Marple had insisted on approaching alone. One did not catch the last layer of deception by appearing with an army. A small fire flickered near the quarry edge. Beside it sat a boy of 10, neatly dressed in school uniform, looking frightened but unharmed. Standing behind him was the veiled lady, tall, leaning lightly on her stick, the heavy black veil concealing her features. "Miss Marple," the woman said. The voice was cultured, slightly husky. "You came. I rather thought you would." Miss Marple stopped 10 yards away. "I generally do when invited, especially when a child's safety is involved. You must be exhausted maintaining so many roles." The veiled lady, the concerned aunt, the grieving widow, and now the protector of the true heir. The veiled woman gave a low laugh. "You are even sharper than Lady Edith described. She always spoke of you with reluctant admiration. That dangerous old woman in the village who sees too much." The boy, Reginald, looked up. "Is she the one who can help us, aunt?" "Hush, dear," the woman said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. Miss Marple noted the hand was elegant, well manicured, but the nails were bitten, an unusual sign of strain in such a composed person. Miss Marple spoke calmly. "Shall we dispense with the veil, Mrs. Harmon, or do you prefer to be called cook? Your excellent seed cake was quite memorable."
There was a long silence. Then the veiled woman slowly lifted the heavy crepe. The face revealed was indeed that of Gossington Hall's cook, plump,
Motherly, red-cheeked, but the eyes were cold and intelligent, quite unlike the cheerful woman who had served meals for the past 3 weeks. "Mrs. Harmon smiled thinly. "I underestimated you. Everyone does. A cook is invisible. She hears everything, sees everything, and no one remembers what she looks like once she leaves the room." Miss Marple nodded. "You poisoned Mr. Blake's port. The others, Keller and the girl, provided the distractions with their tins and forgeries, but you delivered the final blow." "Why, for the boy, Mrs." Harmon's hand tightened on the walking stick. "Reginald is my grandson. Margaret Keller was my daughter. Harold Blake seduced her during the war, promised marriage, then abandoned her when she became pregnant. She died in poverty when Reggie was 4. I swore then that the boy would have what was rightfully his. She reached into a wicker basket and brought out the 9th biscuit tin, smaller, elegant, with a faded picture of Windsor Castle on the lid. "This one is different," she said, opening it. "No lies, only the truth." Inside were genuine documents. Reginald's birth certificate with Harold Blake's signature as father, love letters from Blake to Margaret promising marriage, and a properly witnessed will dated 6 months earlier, leaving the entire estate to my son, Reginald Harold Blake, born 1946. Miss Marple examined the will carefully. Very convincing, but forged, of course. The witness signature is Mr. Petherick's, yet he told me yesterday he had never met the boy. Mrs. Harmon's eyes flashed. Blake owed us everything. I worked in his Manchester factory kitchen for years. I watched him grow rich while my daughter died. When Keller approached me with his plan to torment Blake using the tins, I joined gladly. But Keller and that foolish girl only wanted money. I wanted justice. The boy looked confused. Grandmother, you said father wanted me here. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle but firm. Your grandmother has told you many stories, child. Some of them, I fear, were also lies. Mrs. Harmon stepped closer to the quarry edge, pulling the boy with her. Stay back, Miss Marple. The inspector is watching, I'm sure, but one push, and the boy and I go over together. The final tin will be found with our bodies, explaining everything, the perfect tragic ending, the greedy businessman destroyed by his own past sins, the rightful heir lost in a terrible accident. Miss Marple took one careful step forward. And what of Violet Blake? She has suffered enough. Violet was a fool who married a liar, Mrs. Harmon spat. She can keep her annuity and nothing more. From the ridge a twig snapped. Mrs. Harmon's head jerked sideways for a split second. In that instant Miss Marple moved with surprising speed for her age. She pulled the old revolver from her bag and fired a single shot into the air, not to hit but to startle. Mrs. Harmon flinched. The boy, terrified, twisted free and ran towards Miss Marple. In the same moment, Inspector Craddock and his men came crashing down the path. Mrs. Harmon screamed in rage and tried to lunge after the boy, but her foot caught on a root. She stumbled backwards towards the quarry edge. For one horrifying second she teetered there, arms windmilling, veil blowing in the evening wind. Then she fell. The sound of her body hitting the rocks below was sickening. Miss Marple immediately shielded the boy's eyes and held him close. There, child. It's over now. Inspector Craddock reached them, breathing hard. We heard everything. My men have it recorded. The woman is gone. Later, as they drove back to the village under a starlit sky, young Reginald sat quietly between Miss Marple and the inspector, clutching the silver christening mug from the earlier tin. Will I have to go back to school tomorrow? He asked in a small voice. Miss Marple smoothed his hair. Not tomorrow, dear. There will be many difficult days ahead. But you are not alone. Truth has a way of bringing its own kind of mercy, even after so many lies. At Mead that night, Miss Marple placed the 9th tin on her mantelpiece beside the others. 10 biscuit tins in total. 10 chapters in a story of greed, revenge, and carefully constructed falsehoods. Yet one final question still lingered in her mind as she prepared for bed. Who had really written the very first letter that had summoned her into this web? Chapter 10. The empty tin the drawing room at Gossington Hall was bathed in the soft golden light of a late May afternoon. A small but select gathering had assembled at Miss Marple's quiet invitation. Violet Blake, pale but composed in half-mourning, the Reverend and Mrs. Clement, Dr. Haydock, Inspector Craddock, and young Reginald, who sat close to Miss Marple, still clutching his silver christening mug as though it were an anchor in a stormy sea. On the central table stood all 10 biscuit tins, arranged in a neat row like silent witnesses to the tragedy. Miss Marple poured tea with her usual serenity, as if they had gathered merely to discuss the church flower rota. I think it is time, she said gently, to empty the last tin of its lies.
She began in her soft, precise voice, the needles clicking occasionally between sentences.
The scheme was born of hatred and nurtured over many years. Mrs. Harmon, whose real name we now know, was Mrs. Margaret Harmon, was the true architect. Her daughter, Margaret Keller, had been seduced and abandoned by Harold Blake. When the girl died in poverty, Mrs. Harmon swore revenge. She took a position in Blake's Manchester factory kitchen, watching and waiting. When Blake decided to move south and buy Gossington Hall, Mrs. Harmon came with him as cook. She was perfectly placed, invisible, trusted, always listening. Violet Blake whispered. She seemed so kind. Kindness can be the most effective mask, Miss Marple replied. She recruited Keller, Blake's old partner, by promising him a share of the fortune. She also found her willing accomplice in young Edith Llewellyn, who hated her aunt and wanted freedom. The three of them formed an unholy alliance. The biscuit tins were Mrs. Harmon's masterstroke. Each one contained carefully chosen lies designed to torment Harold Blake, destroy his reputation, and ultimately clear the path for her grandson Reginald to inherit everything. Inspector Craddock nodded. She poisoned Blake's port while the others created chaos with forged letters and fake appearances. Precisely, Miss Marple continued. The veiled lady was played by different people at different times, sometimes by Edith Llewellyn, sometimes by Mrs. Harmon herself. The crisscross footprints, the perfume, small theatrical touches to confuse us. They sent the first tin to me because they knew my involvement would give the affair an air of genuine mystery and bring Scotland Yard into the open. Dr. Haydock leaned forward. But why kill Ferrers? Ferrers knew too much, Miss Marple said. He had helped forge documents and was becoming greedy. Mrs. Harmon strangled him in the summer house. Keller took the blame later because he was already caught. Young Reginald looked up, his eyes wide. Was my father a bad man? Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. He was a weak man, child, ambitious and dishonest, but not entirely evil. He tried, in his own way, to make amends by leaving provision for you, though Mrs. Harmon forged the final will to strengthen the claim. Violet Blake asked the question everyone had been waiting for. Who sent you the very first tin, Miss Marple? The one from Lady Edith.
Miss Marple smiled faintly.
That was Mrs. Harmon's boldest move.
She wrote it herself after strangling the real Lady Edith in Kensington.
She knew that if I received a personal appeal from a dead woman, I would become deeply involved. And she was right. A heavy silence fell over the room. Inspector Craddock spoke at last. Thanks to your evidence and the recordings at the quarry, Keller and Edith Llewellyn will stand trial for their crimes. The boy's position is complicated. But with the genuine documents and your testimony, Mrs. Blake, we can ensure he is cared for properly. Violet looked at the boy for a long moment, then smiled. A real gentle smile. He is Harold's son. That makes him family. I have no wish to see another child suffer for the sins of the past. Gossington Hall has seen enough sorrow. Perhaps it can become a home again. For both of us. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet approval. A most sensible and Christian decision, my dear. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low, Miss Marple walked slowly through the rose garden with young Reginald. The boy was quiet, but not frightened any more. Will the lies stop now? He asked. Yes, dear, she replied. Lies are like weeds. Once you pull out the roots, the garden can grow properly again. You will go to a good school, and Mrs. Blake will look after you. And I shall visit from time to time to see how the roses are doing. Back in her own cottage at Danemed, Miss Marple sat by the window with her knitting. The 10 biscuit tins had been taken away by the police as evidence, all except one. The very first tin, now empty, stood on her mantelpiece as a reminder. She picked up a fresh ball of wool, soft dove gray, and began a new scarf. Outside, the church bells rang for evensong, their sound clear and reassuring across the village green. In the distance, she could see lights coming on in Gossington Hall. New beginnings, perhaps. Human nature is really very consistent, she murmured to herself. Greed, pride, revenge, they never change, only the tins are new. Miss Marple smiled gently and continued knitting as the peaceful rhythms of St. Mary Mead wrapped themselves around her once more. The biscuit tin full of lies was finally empty, and the village slept soundly that night.